You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Is it possible for a seemingly harmless prank to go too far? Now, I'm not talking about the kind that leads to injury or anything serious, just the sort where the prankster doesn't realize that it may be time to stop. Now, something like that happened to me during my second year of teaching high school science, and it began on senior skip day in the late spring of 1992. Little side note is it's hard to believe that those students who will forever be young in my memory, they are now in their 50s. Anyway, I should mention I already knew that the seniors were planning to skip school that day, so I wasn't surprised when I walked into my upper level earth science class and found only a handful of students sitting there. Actually, I'd say the reverse was true. I was surprised any kid even bothered coming to school that day. Among those who showed up were Jen and Rodney. Now, they were high school sweethearts who later married, and they are still together to this day. And the only reason I know that is because Rodney eventually became a teacher, and he worked in the same school that I retired from. Anyway, I'm not exactly sure how the idea started, but we decided to play a prank on the students who had skipped class. And the plan was quite simple. The next day, I pretended to be upset that so many students had been absent. It ruined everything that I had planned. And as a penalty, I was going to give them a surprise exam. Well, the test we came up with, it was impossible. Even I didn't know the answers. For example, one question asked students to describe every major geologic event that had occurred since the day the Earth formed. And in another question, I gave them a diagram of a dinosaur skull and asked them to label all the parts, which they had never learned. Anyway, you get the idea. There was no way they could answer anything on this test. So the next day, shortly after everyone settled into their seats, I made it clear that I wasn't pleased. And I didn't yell or raise my voice or anything like that. I just calmly expressed my frustration. Then I handed out the test while doing my very, very best not to burst out laughing. The students who were in on the joke filled their papers with nonsense. Rodney, for instance, he used one entire page to write out the lyrics to Puff the Magic Dragon. Meanwhile, I sat quietly as the rest of the class struggled to answer the questions. Then suddenly a boy named Billy, he jumps to his feet and he shouted out a few expletives and he ripped his test to pieces in frustration. Now, under normal circumstances, I would have sent him straight to the principal's office, but, it seemed a bit unfair to punish someone for a practical joke. And after a moment, I managed to calm Billy down and he returned to his seat. But then a few minutes later, a girl named Jenny, who just happened to be the daughter of another teacher in the school, she burst into tears. And that's when I realized the prank had gone too far. I quickly told the class what was going on, and then I got back to my regular teaching. Well, today I have another story about a practical joke, one that unfolded over 6 months on the radio show Truth or Consequences in the mid-1940s. And the target was a New Jersey man named Rudolph Wickel. And it is a fun story, but as I was researching it, I began to wonder if the producers took the prank a bit too far. Or, possibly they did end it at just the right moment. So keep that question in the back of your mind as we listen to the story. Aren't we devils? I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Let's begin today's story with a question. When is a piece of wood like a queen? Again, when is a piece of wood like a queen? And I'll give you 5 seconds to come up with the answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. Now, my guess is you didn't get it. The answer is a piece of wood is like a queen when it's a ruler. That's an example of the nearly impossible questions that were typical of the radio and later television show Truth or Consequences. Although it was billed as a quiz program, the real goal was for the contestants to get the question or the truth wrong. And of course, that meant they had to face the consequences, which was typically performing some kind of outrageous stunt. Now, the bulk of these occurred live on stage, and they were over within a few minutes, but others would take place off the air. They'd be introduced on one episode, the person would then follow what was ever required for the next week, and then they come back the following Saturday and tell what happened. For example, one woman on the show was instructed to wink at every man she saw for the next week. The catch was that one of these men would give her $100 or more than $1,800 today when she did. But when she returned the following week, she complained she had followed the instructions exactly, but no one had handed her the money. That's when the show's creator and master of ceremonies, Ralph Edwards, pointed out that she hadn't winked at him. She promptly did, and he handed her the $100. In another stunt, two men who apparently had never met were brought on stage and introduced to the audience. Their task was quite simple. They would be sent backstage, talk to one another, learn as much about the other as possible, then come back to the stage, and whoever could recite the most, give back the most information, that person would win the contest. But again, there was a catch. The contest was rigged. That's because one of the men was actually the other's cousin. The two of them had not seen each other in decades, not since they were children, so there was no way the one would recognize the other as his cousin. Then they returned to the stage, and the one man was shocked by how much this other man knew about him. But eventually he did come to the realization that this was his long-lost cousin. Well, you get the idea. It was all meant to be lighthearted fun, and amazingly, there was never a shortage of people willing to step on stage and make fools of themselves for the chance to win a prize. Of course, there was an entire team working behind the scenes to come up with all these gags, and as the show grew in popularity, the stunts grew bigger and crazier. Just as an example, in March of 1950, Ralph Edwards announced that they would broadcast their 10th anniversary show from the first town that changed its name to Truth or Consequences. And in a special election held on March 31st of 1950, the residents of Hot Springs, New Mexico voted 1,294 to 295 to do just that. So if you've ever wondered how Truth or Consequences, New Mexico got its name, now you know. Another one of the gags that they came up with first made its premiere on the show in April of 1944. On every show, Edwards would blurt out, "Is there a Mr. Wickel in the house?" He'd repeat this every week, but no one stepped forward for months, and there is a good reason for that. Wickel is an obscure last name. According to the latest U.S. Census, there are only about 350 people named Wickel across the entire nation today. So the chance of there being a Mr. Wickel in the audience of any Truth or Consequences show, well, that was next to nothing. As a result, it became a running gag on the show, and it's one that was discussed in newspapers all across the nation, but as the months rolled on, no Mr. Wickel ever showed up. That was until around 8:45 p.m. on Saturday, November 4th of 1944. That's when Ralph Edwards once again queried the audience, "Is there a Mr. Wickel in the house?" And to everyone's surprise, there was a response in the affirmative. The audience erupted in applause, and Edwards nearly lost his composure. Of course, the man was brought up on stage and told Edwards that he was 45-year-old Rudolph J. Wickel, an engineering representative for the Fitzgibbons Boiler Company in Verona, New Jersey. The reality was the entire Truth or Consequences team was well prepared for this moment, and that's mainly because they had known for days that he would be in the audience. But Rudy Wickel, he himself, he did not know what he was about to get into. And here's how it all unfolded. First, he was presented with a number of items that were imprinted with the name Wickel on them. That included a wicker chair, which I assume was because of the similarity of the words wicker and Wickel. Then there was a doormat, pillowcases, and a tablecloth. He was also given a personalized bassinet for the little Wickels, and bassinets were a war scarcity. Although I should point out his two children, they had long outgrown the use of a bassinet. But that was all minor stuff compared to what came next. Ralph Edwards pulled out of his pocket the will of one Peckinpah P. Wickel, a long-lost relative who had left behind $1,000 in silver dollar coins. Adjusted for inflation, that's around $18,560 today. The will told of the treasure being buried in a woodland around which a modern city grew. And to determine the exact location, Edwards pulled out an old map. He then read off the latitude and longitude and told Wickel that the coins were buried at the site of an old ice house at the corner of Walnut and Prospect Streets in Holyoke, Massachusetts. Edwards then handed Wickel a pick and shovel along with a railroad ticket that would take him from New York City, where the show was being recorded, to Springfield, which is just south of Holyoke. That train was scheduled to leave at midnight, and upon arriving at 7:15 Sunday morning, the plan was that Wickel would be greeted by Holyoke Mayor Henry J. Topfert. There was just one problem with this plan. Ralph Edwards didn't just reveal the location of the buried treasure to Rudolph Wickel. He had simultaneously broadcasted to his entire listening audience of millions of people. And there's no surprise here, even before the show ended, hundreds of Holyoke residents, including women who had hastily thrown their coats over their nightgowns, they raced over to the empty lot where the ice house had once stood. It was estimated that at least 50 people were turning over the soft dirt using whatever tool they had handy. Yes, some had shovels, but others used spoons, some used their bare hands. In fact, one man was observed using a divining rod to help locate the buried treasure. In the end, it was 23-year-old Joseph Roy and his 14-year-old brother-in-law Henry Martell who struck it rich. At first, they had dug in random spots near the northern edge of the lot, but they shifted to the southern side after Henry noticed a park bench near the sidewalk. So the pair lifted the bench aside and began digging. Sure enough, at a depth of around 3 feet or 1 meter, they found the box. It weighed approximately 65 pounds or 29.5 kilograms, and they hauled it to the surface, lifted up the lid, and inside they found a burlap bag that was filled with the silver coins. The two then quickly jumped into Roy's truck and drove to the nearby Roger Smith Hotel, where representatives from the Truth or Consequences show had been staying. But a problem quickly arose. You see, it was unclear whether the coins belonged to the young men or to Rudy Wickel. And until the matter could be settled, the bag of coins was handed over to the Holyoke police for safekeeping. In the meantime, there was a question as to whether Wickel was still on his way to Holyoke. It's possible he learned that the treasure had been found and then decided to just turn around and go back home. Well, that question was answered early Sunday morning when Wickel stepped off the train. And that's when Mayor Topfert informed Rudy that the treasure had already been found, and since the law required that buried treasure belonged to the finders, he had absolutely no claim to it. Rudy Wickel, he had traveled all that way for absolutely nothing. There's no doubt that Wickel was disappointed, but he was able to spend the remainder of the day getting a whirlwind tour of Holyoke. First, he was taken to the ice house site and shown the hole where the treasure had been discovered. Then Rudy was interviewed by radio station WBZA, and there he got to meet the two treasure finders. The two had already agreed to split what they had found, and taking pity on the man, each one of them handed Wickel one of their silver dollars. Then, after the radio appearance, he appeared at a cocktail party at the Roger Smith Hotel, where he was the guest of honor. Not long after that, Wickel departed on the 6:05 p.m. train back to New York City, and all he had to show for his efforts were a couple of silver dollar coins, a pick, and a shovel. As for the two treasure hunters, first there was Joseph Roy, and he had been discharged from the Army the previous year after a 3-year stint. He said he was going to use his $499 to help support his wife, their 2-year-old son, and a baby that the couple was expecting the following month. Of course, 14-year-old Henry was a bit too young to have a family of his own, so he intended to spend $50 on Christmas gifts, and then he was going to save the remainder for what he jokingly called, quote, "my children in 1954, unquote. Of course, this really wasn't some long-lost buried treasure. In fact, Al Paschal, who was the Truth or Consequences stage manager, he had traveled to Holyoke the previous week to orchestrate the event. Not only was Mayor Topfert fully aware of the ruse, but so was James T. Clark, the superintendent of the Holyoke Public Works. He was the one who directed his crew to dig several holes at the ice house site under the pretense that they were taking building soundings. And once the work was completed and the area was clear, it was Clark who buried the box containing the loot. Then a bulldozer leveled the site, and that eliminated any evidence of the excavation. When questioned about Mr. Wickel losing out on the prize money, Ralph Edwards said,
"I hadn't counted on the gold rush, but I guess we have to find a consolation prize for Wickel."
And there definitely was going to be a consolation prize, but in typical Truth or Consequences tradition, they were not going to make it easy for Wickel to get. On the following Saturday's broadcast from New York, Ralph Edwards opened the show by stating,
"This is Edwards who got into a pickle over Wickel, who didn't get a mickle."
Joseph Roy and Henry Martell made a brief appearance with their silver dollars on display, and it was also announced that Truth or Consequences would repay the citizens of Holyoke for all they went through by putting on a non-broadcast show in Holyoke 2 days later. Rudy Wickel also appeared on the broadcast, joined by a purported attorney identified only as Appleby. My hunch is it wasn't a real attorney. Anyway, he presented Wickel with a $1,000 check supposedly written years ago by his granduncle Peckinpah Wickel. The catch was that neither the bank's name nor its location had been filled in. But Wickel was given a single clue, although it wasn't a great clue, that the bank was, quote, somewhere in the United States, unquote, and they gave him 1 week to determine where his consolation prize had been deposited. Good luck with that one. Then on Monday, November 13th of 1944 at 8:30 p.m., a sold-out performance of Truth or Consequences proceeded as planned at the Holyoke War Memorial. Ticket sales generated $1,200, which is around $22,250 today, which was then donated to the city for the construction of a new playground to be called, get this, Wickel Park, and I love this part, it was to be complete with a statue of Rudolph Wickel. As for the show itself, contestants were selected from the audience and none of them were able to guess the truth, so they all had to face the consequences. And since none of us were there, here are a few examples of what unfolded that night. One man had to roll up his trousers, put on a hula skirt, and do a hula dance. Another gentleman was asked to imitate a woman who had just come home from a tiresome shopping trip and was undressing to take a bath. He then awkwardly struggled with a girdle and removed his undergarments in a deliberately exaggerated manner, if you know what I mean. In another challenge, a blindfolded woman was tasked with selecting a ripe melon, unaware that her choices also included 2 bald men. Then there was a woman who was asked to telephone a friend in Holyoke, and she did just that, barking each time that Edwards tapped her on her back. It was only at the end of the call that she was allowed to explain the situation to her bewildered friend. Of course, also making an appearance on the stage that night was Rudy Wickel, who had still not located the bank where the prize money had been deposited, although he did receive a hint a bit earlier while dining at the Roger Smith Hotel. That's when he received a message from S.J. Moore, who was a sales manager for the business directory publisher R.L. Polk & Company in New York. It read, quote, R.L. Polk & Company would like to present you with latest editions of Polk's Banker's Encyclopedia listing nation's 14,000 banks. A postcard to each bank would locate your $1,000. Present this wire to our New York office to receive your complimentary copy, unquote. It should come as no surprise, but Wickel never sent any of those 14,000 postcards. But during his appearance on the Saturday, November 18th broadcast, it was revealed that he had finally identified the bank he had been searching for. It turned out to be the same exact bank in Verona, New Jersey, where he conducted his own banking. And this time he really did receive the $1,000, although it did come with the familiar twist. The funds, said to have been deposited during the Civil War while his granduncle was still alive, they were paid out in worthless Confederate currency. But once again, Attorney Appleby came on stage and revealed that a codicil to a codicil in Peckinpah Wickel's will had been found. It said that he had placed the real money in a 2-ton safe and that was wheeled out on stage, but the only catch was that the combination, it had been long lost. After the show ended, the safe was going to be sent to Wickel's home in Verona, and he had just 1 week to open it, and this is really important, he had to return it undamaged. That meant no hammers, no chisels, and no explosives. Like clockwork, Wickel was back on the show the following Saturday, where it was announced that with the help of Verona police, they were able to get the safe open. But what Wickel found inside was useless. It was only one half of the $1,000 bill. His task on this week's show was to locate the other half. And I'll just throw in a little side note here. Ralph Edwards did consult with the Secret Service to determine the legality of the stunt. He was informed that it wasn't a crime to rip the bill in half, but any bill containing less than 2/5 of the bill would be considered worthless. If one has 3/5 or more, it's worth the full $1,000, while anything between 2/5 and 3/5 would be worth $500. Which means that since Wickel already had one half, he had technically already won $500, although he probably wasn't aware of that. So just where was the missing half of that $1,000 bill? To uncover its whereabouts, Rudy Wickel was presented with yet another puzzle. He was told the only living being who knew its location was an old talking parrot. So the bird was handed over to Wickel, who spent the following week listening intently to it. But despite his efforts, the parrot just repeatedly uttered the same word over and over again. He just kept saying Ken. Wickel finally conceded defeat, and he returned the parrot to the show. The December 2nd, 1954 Truth or Consequences show was broadcast from Chicago this time, and Rudy Wickel, he was sitting in the NBC studios in New York City listening in. During the show, Edwards confirmed that the bird had indeed been saying Ken, which he revealed is neck, spelled backwards. Neck. Then he chuckled and reached out to remove a small capsule that had been hidden in the bird's neck feathers. And sure enough, inside that capsule was the missing half of that $1,000 bill. But Truth or Consequences wasn't quite done with Rudy Wickel. Ralph Edwards announced he was going to place the half of the bill in a book and then mail it to Wickel's home. And once he received it, all he needed to do was open to page 13 of that book and he would get his prize. Sounds simple enough, but what Wickel didn't know was that Edwards was about to pull one final gag on him. You see, later in the broadcast, when Wickel was no longer listening, Edwards asked everyone in his radio audience to mail a book to Wickel's home address. And you know what that could mean. He could get hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of books delivered to his doorstep. Edwards then let out his familiar catchphrase, one that he had used on the show many times before.
Aren't we devils?
He added,
I can just see his face when the postman keeps coming to the front door. But this time he'll get the $1,000. Mr. Wickel can no longer say that his fortune proved fickle.
And sure enough, the first book arrived on the Monday after the show. The book, appropriately titled 24 Hours by Louis Bromfield, had been sent via special delivery by Vera Pavlica of Holyoke of all places. So Wickel quickly turned to page 13, but he didn't find the missing piece of his prize. Instead, it was a 1944 100-franc note which had been issued for use in occupied France. Keep in mind that France had just been liberated from the Germans months before. The next book arrived with 11 cents postage due, which is around $2 today, and it was titled The Devil Shall Pay. And yes, Wickel did have to pay the postage, but once again, the book didn't contain the prize money. By that evening, 765 books had been examined without success. And by the following day, they had thumbed through in total an estimated 5,800 books, yet they had still not located the missing half of that $1,000 bill. Rudy told reporters,
And the post office people tell me when the books start coming in from the west, I'll really have some mail.
He added,
We'll find the right page 13. All the neighbors' children are helping. We're finding the darndest things on other page 13s. Confederate money, German marks, all sorts of stuff.
It wouldn't be until Friday, December 8th of 1944 that they found the missing half. It was on page 13 of a book titled Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And to find it, they only had to comb through 5,876 other books to do so. The following day, Rudolph Wickel would make his final appearance on Truth or Consequences. Ralph Edwards turned to him and said,
Thanks a million, Mr. Whittle.
To which he replied,
Thanks 8,000, Mr. Edwards.
and in exchange for Wickel's participation in the multi-week stunt, 4 seats at the weekly Truth or Consequences show were dedicated to the Wickel family. While he had finally received the prize money, the stunt hadn't quite ended for the Wickels, and that's because the books continued to arrive in the mail. In total, they received in excess of, you ready for this? In excess of 18,000 books. Wow. Now, it is documented that the first 5,000 were given to soldiers at Fort Shanks in Orangeburg, New York, but it's unclear what happened to the remainder of the books. In the end, the Wickel gag cost the Truth or Consequences show an estimated $4,000, which is around $74,000 today. But the amount of publicity that they received in exchange for that investment, it was priceless. Now, if you ever find yourself in Holyoke, Massachusetts, don't bother looking for Wickel Park or even a statue of Rudolph Wickel. Although the city accepted the show's $1,200 donation, many residents objected to naming a park after a man with no connection to Holyoke beyond his role in a radio show prank. As a result, the funds were placed in a local bank while officials considered how to best spend them. So you're probably wondering what happened to the money. Well, fast forward to 1965. This is 21 years after the money was donated, and a special aldermanic committee was set up to investigate what happened to those funds. And to the best of anyone's knowledge, the money was never spent. The value of the fund, if indeed it was still in the bank, was estimated to be worth approximately $2,400, which is nearly $25,000 today. So a letter was sent off to Ralph Edwards, among others, and he wrote the following back.
We have checked our files and find that on August 28, 1947, Mayor Henry G. Topford of Holyoke asked for permission for the Wickel money held in escrow to be used to buy apparatus for the playground attached to the newly completed Memorial Village built for veterans and their families. He asked for the power of attorney or some authority so they could order the apparatus for the playground. They were heading for an October 1 dedication, 1947. I wrote Mr. Rudy Wickel for his approval. He granted it. Hal Paschal, my producer of the Truth or Consequences radio show, now deceased, wrote the mayor on September 25, 1947, stating that Mr. Wickel had approved his request. Paschal asked that a plaque or some recognition be placed on the playground stating in effect, quote, "This equipment donated by Truth or Consequences in honor of Rudolph G. Wickel," unquote. I hope this answers your question. Please give my kindest regard to our friends in Holyoke.
Well, that may have been the terms they agreed to. The question is, was the money ever spent? Well, I found the answer on the front page of the September 29th, 1947 edition of the Holyoke Transcript Telegram. That's just 2 days before the supposed October 1st dedication of the playground. The article states a playground was being built on Westfield Road at the southeast corner of the Memorial Village housing development, which is exactly what Ralph Edwards had said in 1965 in reply to the aldermen. That field, it still does exist, and it consists of a small playground, a volleyball net, and a Little League baseball diamond. It was originally referred to as the Memorial Village Playground, but many referred to it as the Mayer Tract Playground. And that's because all of those homes were built by land developer and former Alderman Joseph R. Mayer. Today, it's simply referred to as Mayer Field. Now, there is a video on YouTube where a man films Mayer Field today, but he questioned why it had that name. He said he was going to do some research, but he never did any kind of follow-up. But at least we can say we now know. What I'll do is I'll place a link to that video in this episode's description as well as on my website. That's if you'd like to take a look at it. I have to say, after researching this, I don't think the city ever officially named it Mayer Field. Basically, it just got that name through continued use. And while I certainly don't expect them to ever rename the park after Rudolph Wickel, I am quite certain that the plaque that was required to be erected in his honor, it is not there. Come on, Julio. You accepted the money but never followed through on what was promised. It's time to put up the plaque. Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. So did they take the prank too far, or did they end it at just the right time? And you may feel differently, but I think they milked the gag for all it was worth and they ended it at the perfect moment. Another week or two, and I think the audience may have tired of Wickel repeatedly not getting his prize. Now, I did try to find audio of Ralph Edwards saying, "Aren't we devils?" But very few of those early Truth or Consequences shows still exist. I did listen to a couple of episodes, but he didn't state it in either of those. There's also a copy of a Ralph Edwards record where it says right on the cover, "Aren't we devils?" But unfortunately, the copy on the Internet Archive, it only had the first few minutes of the recording, and he didn't state it there either. So the voices of Edwards and Wickel that you just heard, that's just me reading them and having my voice altered using 11 Labs AI. The Useless Information Podcast is proud to be part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. So visit airwavemedia.com to explore their ever-growing collection of some of the very best podcasts out there. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope you'll tune in for the next episode. Take care, everyone. Bye.